All right. We're talking about masks today.
The mask.
I have to admit, Gabe, when you first brought up mask, I was like, I don't know. I kind of snickered at you in my head, like, really? Like, what is this about? And I still kind of do, because I think it's an interesting term for something that's actually pretty deep. But what was your initial reaction, Ron, to the idea of masks?
Yeah, the same. I mean, I think my first thought was, are we going to talk about the movie with Jim Carrey? And
That's what most people think of.
but the further you got into it and explained it, the more, actually, if I'm honest, the more worried I got. So I was like, oh man, this is going to be really hard. And I'm going to have to share a lot and be super honest with this group. And again, it's not a one and done with that. Like, it's a daily and weekly process of going, all right, got to show up, be fully present and be fully, alive in myself and share this and be honest and trust these guys.
Yeah. You recommended a book to us at that point called The Cure, which I don't know if everyone will always hear about that, but that was really helpful for me and kind of understanding this concept more. Yeah. I'm curious how do you define what is the mask? What is that idea in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, first of all, The Cure, like double foot stomp that. And I think we'll provide in the show notes lots of resources because there's, none of this is original in the sense that there's a lot of, there's a tradition of thought in all the things that we're talking about. This is just our way of talking about these things. Mm-hmm. But I think when we talk about the mask, I mean, I really go back to, the story of evil and the story of human rebellion, and that, like, when we rebelled against God, we hid. Like, that was the first response to it, was we felt shame. And so we hid because we felt ashamed. Right. And I made a statement in the last episode that, like, Adam and Eve hid because of their shame, and we've been hiding ever since. And so then that begs the question, like, how are we hiding? Like, we're not hiding in a grove covering ourselves with fig leaves, which, by the way, that's what they did. They tried to cover their shame, but they did it with a fig leaf, which is sort of this, like, ridiculous image, actually. Like, it doesn't work.
Yeah. Oh, I was taught early on, like, fun and laughing is not part of God's design. And I'm like, BS, because the fig leaf is actually, like, hilarious when you think about it. When you think about the whole idea of it, it's like a stand-up bit.
And it's, like, probably scratchy and itches and, like, it's weird.
Uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's weird, very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But you think about that, and, like, so they tried to cover their shame with something that couldn't possibly sufficiently cover what they were trying to hide. And so we're still doing that. And so this concept of a mask is what are the particular ways in which we are still hiding because we're ashamed. And so there's two ways to think about this. And so when we do this exercise in the groups, we actually, like, make paper plate mask. And there's an exercise that we, on the front side, we write what we're trying to project to the world. Like, we're trying to present something to the world as we go about our life. And on the inside of the mask, we write words about what is it we're trying to cover and we're trying to hide. And so just, for example, and there's, like, it's very specific and particular and unique to each person, but, that we may be presenting like bravado, like this a mask could be that, I'm confident, I've got life figured out, I know everything about everything. And so that's, like, how, and we all know people, like, that's how they present and show up in the world. But most of the time that is covering something that person's ashamed of and hiding. And so they may be covering their own sense of inadequacy, their own sense that they're not enough. That's all tied back to their story, things that have happened to them, where they were, taught to believe lies. And so now they're hiding. And that's what we mean by mask.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys want to share any. I wrote down a couple. I'm still working on this. Like, I'm still not quite sure all the masks I have. That's one of the things about them. They're so deceitful. It like took me a while to uncover what they were, because they're just have become such a part of your way of being. But I think so far I've recognized a couple. One is the mask of I don't need anything.
Yeah.
And it's a weird one that I still haven't wrapped my head around, but I think I've got this mask of like, oh, I don't need anything, I'm good, I take care of everyone else kind of thing. And to the point of the mask, like, well, then what that happens is then people get to know that Steve.
Yes.
So they never get to know the real Steve.
Right.
Which I've started realizing now, like, oh yeah, oftentimes my needs don't get met by others. And I can't blame it on them. It's because I didn't even let them see the need was there. But another one I uncovered from earlier on that's kind of interesting, and looking at my full story, is the mask of like, oh, I'm cool, I'm not quirky. It's like, no, I'm totally quirky and nerdy. And coming to embrace that more in adulthood is actually fun and freeing. But I think for so many years growing up, probably like a lot of kids, like the middle school experience, basically, it's like, oh, I'm cool, and trying to like fit in to something I'm not, which I think had psychological and heart level impacts that are definitely still messing with me today.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about how hard it is to, figure out your mask, and I think that's definitely been true for me. Like it's a work that could take months and years, to really fully uncover what am I trying to hide and what am I projecting. One of the tools that I used is asking those close to me, and I think that's given interesting results, but in particular asking my wife, like, hey, Lindsay, tell me, what are things that you see that I project to the world? And then tying those back to, okay, is that actually tied somewhere in my story? Am I trying to cover something where I'm ashamed, or I lack identity in Jesus and I'm trying to find it in something else? And so for me, I mean, one of mine is I'm only loved if I do. And so I have to do things in order to earn love. And if I don't do things, that I'm unlovable, which is, such a lie, but that's so hard to really break free from. And it takes a long time and a lot of truth and being covered by other people to be reminded, like, no, I am loved, by Jesus as I am, and I don't need to do anything in order to show up.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, man.
Yeah. No, it's powerful. I mean, when you're able to name with that level of detail, I mean, that's where you really start to get at the transformative work of the heart that we're all after. And we do need to like name those things with each other so that like we can call each other out on that. Cause I think we all get triggered, right? Like that's a concept we've talked a lot about too, is, that we have particular lies that we believe that are based on particular ways that we've been wounded in our story. And so we're hiding because we've been wounded and because we believe these lies. And then what happens is inadvertently in relationships, we've got gaping wounds and we press on each other just a little bit. It's not it's not intentional. Like, I'm not trying to hurt you, Ron, but in a conversation, I touch on that woundedness that says you're only valuable if you perform, and you didn't do a good job. And, then the feeling is outsized, right? Then I feel this enormous pain that like is not congruent with like what was actually being done to me. But that's the way like we do things in relationships.
Yeah.
Which is why it's so important to be curious about people.
Yeah.
And hey, if all of a sudden like you get an emotional response from somebody in your group or somebody you're close to in a relationship that seems outsized from the comment or whatever, like I think it's an opportunity to really be curious of, hey, what is this hitting on?
Yes.
And really unpacking that mystery that is the person, not trying to solve it, but just being curious and uncovering that with them.
That's right. And that goes back to recognizing emotion, right? Because emotion is what we experience. Like when we experience pain because somebody touches on a woundedness, touches on something that we're trying to hide and cover up, and is that then we feel. But if we don't have adequate language to describe how we actually feel, what we tend to do is name like only primary emotions, which Ron, you named it in one of the previous episodes of, for guys often we'll just feel anger,
Mhm.
and I'm just angry, but I couldn't tell you why, because I haven't really been introspective enough to know like what's really what really happened there, which is super unhelpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the phrases that that I've begun to use is when I feel those things and feel like I've been hurt or attacked by someone else, is to go back to them and say, "Hey, the story I'm telling myself is blank," and then be able to name some of the things that I felt that they may have said, but this is the way I received it. So often there's that disconnect in communication, right? Where you're like, I didn't mean that at all, but that's the way you heard it. But unless you can actually name those things, from the receiver, like this is the story I'm telling myself, is that, I'm not valued because you told me I did a bad job. Well, all of a sudden you're going, man, that's not what I meant at all.
Yeah.
Like, I just wanted you to, hear this feedback or whatever. And it's an opportunity to really reconcile a relationship in a way that's healthy, as opposed to, well, I'm going to cancel that person or write them off, or all of a sudden, that relationship's strained or broken. And in culture, I mean, that's what you see most often.
That's right. Yeah, we move to control each other instead of really just paying attention to our own story and our own heart, our own woundedness, our own mask. And so it's really true that the degree to which we've processed our own story really drives and dictates the level of maturity that we can have in our relationships as well.
Yeah, an area that strikes me to be aware of as a leader in a group is this whole concept we talked about of curiosity and listening and questions, is the idea of being curious for someone, like on their behalf, versus for yourself. So like Ron, the example you gave is a great example of true curiosity that lets us uncover the mystery, or like lay what's there on the table. And what can happen even with good intentions is like, Gabe, you share how you're doing today and I'm trying to be curious, or maybe a mask shows up and I'm trying to be curious. But really what I'm doing is trying to collect information in order to diagnose you. Mm-hmm. And some people are just wired for that. And so it's fine. Like that's how you are. But just to be aware of it, especially in the groups, that you want to be curious almost as if you're like stepping in on their behalf to help them like discover for themselves. Mm-hmm. There's no agenda to your curiosity. Because it can be easy to slip into like, well, I'm asking questions, but really I'm just like collecting data points to then like give you a diagnosis. And even if I don't give you the diagnosis, on the receiving end, you still feel if that's the direction someone's headed, and it almost makes it worse. So to try as much as you can to just be like, drop the agenda and just be truly curious. I think that mode of the group is so important.
That's so right, because it's like a personal pet peeve of mine, is like when somebody's asking questions because they need to ask them, not because it's actually helpful for you.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I think that is a great point to pay attention to, especially in leadership. And that goes back to the consuming thing, right? Like I'm not asking questions because I need it, which is a form of consuming and using. Instead, it's like, how can I serve you through my curiosity?
It's such a nuanced thing, but has a big impact. And when we're talking about masks and triggers, it's like these are sensitive areas that go back maybe your whole life. So we have to be careful of that nuance.
And that's a skill set, I'll say, that takes time to develop. I mean, not to get us too far down this curiosity road, but I do think it's important to name, like, hey, there's some questions that should be asked that are going to take a long time for you to actually figure out what's the best question to help this person uncover their own mystery, right? Because they don't know. And so, getting at deep desires, getting at fears, just helping people unpack things in a new way. You're not there as a reporter interrogating them, but you're just helping them peel back the layers. And that takes a lot of time and a lot of practice.
It does. It's a long effort in the same direction. This work of disciple making. It's not something quick that we can manufacture. And that's why we're committed to journey for a longer season with each other. Ron, I'm curious, like when you think about being in a group and leading a group, once we enter into this work of the mask and people are naming what their mask is, but and this happens, I mean, this happened recently. There was something recently in our work together where you came to me and you said, hey, you're making this decision and it looks an awful lot like, your mask. And I got to ask you, like, are you doing the right thing? Or are you doing this because like that's part of the way you cover and hide and pose your way through the world? And I really appreciated that because I felt incredibly seen in that moment. And it was the right question in the right moment. So what have you learned about that work of calling people out in their mask?
Well, I think first and foremost, it starts with relationship. Like I think, like Steve, you said earlier, you're in a high trust world when you're talking about these things and really being honest, and you're being trusted with a lot, and I think treating people like I think you say, I can't remember the terminology, but it's like, a glass sculpture or something that you're holding, and not being just all willy-nilly with it and tossing it around, but man, treating it like it is precious because this is a person that was created in God's image. So first, not just being flippant about those things that they're sharing, and in particular their mask, but that happens within the context of relationship, and you can only go so far as your relationship has carried you and the trust that you've built. So like you said, these groups are existing. They've been, hopefully at this point, 6 months in, and you guys are beginning to unpack even more of your own story in this exercise called the mask. So it starts there, and when you have that trust, and guys are sharing, hey, this is what I'm showing up as, this is what I'm covering and hiding from. Then I think it's about trusting your guys on your right and left to actually speak into that. And so, when you answer the question, how are you doing? And all of a sudden you hear like, ooh, that sounds an awful lot like their mask. I think just asking that question, like, hey, this is what I'm hearing you say. Are you, in fact, showing up in this way? And that's one of those questions I was talking about earlier that's so powerful because a lot of times we don't even see it ourselves.
Yeah. And something, I think we did a little of this together that helps too is, especially as the leader, have people give each other permission to go there. So let's say we're in a group and we just shared our masks with each other. And I'm leading it. I might say, all right, so if you're open to the other guys kind of helping you identify when this is happening, like give us permission, like verbally actually say, and I might start it and be like, I give you guys permission to call me when you see my mask showing up. Cause then you feel more okay going there when it happens versus that moment of, oh gosh, is this okay to say? Am I going to be like triggering them or making, am I allowed to go there? I think that permission giving helps too.
Yeah. I'll say too, I just think that's really the essence of these groups, right? Iron collective, iron sharpening iron. This is where this group really reaches like what it's designed to be, is when you can speak into another's life in a way that's going to sharpen them, help them see themselves clear, help them name lies that they're believing. All of that happens, through this mask exercise. And that's really the accountability that we all need as believers, because if we live our lives in isolation and never have those mirrors that show us, ways we're showing up in an unhealthy way, then we're deceiving ourselves.
That's right. Yeah, it's such an important work. I think I've shared before that for me, like, there's places where we are tempted to wear a mask more than other places. And of course, as a pastor, one of the hardest places for me is church.
Yeah.
I just want to name that in this setting, because I think the church can be a place that can be destructive in that way. Is that like, it's just because there's so much expectation to present yourself in a certain way that, like, I remember when I first went into the ministry, Madeline, our daughter, had just been born. So we had a newborn baby and we just moved to a new city and life was a mess, right? Like it was not easy. And I remember showing up to church and like we would often have like the worst argument of our whole week
Right
on the
before.
way to
Yeah.
church because we lived
Yep.
like 35, 40 minutes from church, and so we had to like get this baby out of bed and like go to like basically all day church, and it was just always a disaster.
Uh-huh.
And I remember like, but you would have like you would be fighting, and then you like open the doors, and then like it was like immediately. And I didn't have this language back then, but the mask went on.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And it's like, man, I'm all of a sudden the guy that's got it together. There's nothing wrong. And then people are like, hey, back to our question, how are you?
Oh yeah.
I'm
Great.
30 times in a
Yeah.
row.
I'm so
Doing
great.
Great.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
You can always tell when the mask is up when someone's voice goes, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I think younger generations are doing a lot better with this, and authenticity is more of a given
Yeah.
or an expectation. Because, yeah, there is a sense of in the workplace, it's harder, but also there needs to be some amount
Right.
of, I don't know where the balance is, but I've seen also people now go to the other extreme where it's all, especially online, it's just all about like, just air everything and be real. And it's like, well, there's also a healthy amount of, masking is not the right word, but there's a healthy balance. And so I think that discussion can be good too of, not wearing the mask, but also I
What?
think we can go, our culture is just so wired for extremes. So then we run away from the mask and do the other extreme of
Yeah.
like,
I think what
you
you're
show
naming,
up that day at church and just start telling everyone you run into about
Right.
the
And
argument.
and it's not
Yeah.
that binary.
It's not that
yeah,
binary.
I was going to say what you're naming is the safe space,
Uh-huh.
and those are few and far between, and it's not everywhere,
Yeah.
right? But it's finding those safe spaces that you can share, and those safe people that you can share with. And the other place, I mean, that's outside of church that you wear a mask a lot of times is social media.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the one that I think everyone knows is like, is this real or not? And oftentimes it's not. Every picture is a smiley, happy picture. And the reality is there's a lot more behind the scenes. But that's like culturally, I mean,
Yes.
the biggest pose that exists.
Yeah, and that's why I recently got off of social media permanently, and a big reason was because I was so tempted to just present myself, and and it sounds like what, Gabe, are you like in 7th grade or whatever? But like I would find myself through the day thinking like, ooh, what could I post? What could I present? And like, how could I like shape people's
Yeah.
thoughts about me? And I would think that, guys. I mean,
Yeah.
I would. And so I just recognized, man, that's just not where I need to be right now. So that's not a critique on everyone being on social media, but I think for me,
Yeah.
it was just way too triggering of a place from triggering in the sense that I was tempted to mask up and be present a false self. But I think, Steve, you do have a good point that, and Brian used the word safe place, that there are layers of authenticity and that's just wisdom. That like it's really a few people that we can kind of share everything going on with. And then there's a little bit larger group that we can share more. And then there's, with the masses, whatever
Yeah.
that looks like, we share less. But I do think we don't have to wear a mask in any of those. It's possible that as we mature, we can still show up as a version, an appropriately authentic version of our true selves.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you said that. And to me, it just so vividly sparks this thought of really all we're talking about in all these episodes, sharing emotion, identifying masks and taking those off and being our real self. Really, a lot of that in doing that with each other is just practice for us to be able to do that with God. And I think so much of this comes back to if we're going to have a real, true relationship with God and actually experience the awesomeness that He's promised and offered us, it comes through interacting with Him in this authentic way without the mask and sharing our true emotion with Him. And so in the groups, for me, so much of it became this like a practice zone. Not that didn't matter, but like a place to practice how it should be with God. Because, I could experience this conversation in the past as, all right, add another thing to my Christian checklist. Got to take off my mask. Got to got to make sure and it's another gotta do thing. Whereas I think, I feel pretty confident that at the core of this is God saying, no, you actually, this is about experiencing joy and fulfillment. It's not just like something you got to do because that's what Christians got to do. And that to me just changes the whole framing and experience of it.